Hello, grade 9. We are going to introduce Unit 3, which is about civil rights and the introduction of the civil rights movement in America in the 1960s. So we're going to start with this launch text. This selection is an example of an informative text, a type of writing in which the author examines concepts through the careful selection, organization, and analysis of information. This is the type of writing you will develop in the performance-based assessment at the end of the unit. So as you read, think about how the writer describes events. Mark the text to help you answer this question. How does the writer help the reader understand the importance of these events? So this unit will be about the civil rights movement in the 1960s in America mostly, and it will be informative text. So it will be organizing information and giving you an analysis of the information as well. 1963, the year that changed everything. During the Children's Crusade of May 1963, police turned fire hoses on young civil rights protesters, including this girl who was knocked to the ground by the force of water. This is the picture that we're talking about here. So what they're talking about, in 1963 in America, it's called, they went through what is called the civil rights movement. Civil is like another word for like just people, okay? If you are in, like, for example, we are in a civilized society, that means that the people here, they are civil, they are like nice with each other, everybody has rights, they're given like different rights and different rules that make them like allowed to live a happy and peaceful life. In the 1960s in America, Black people were still treated as less than any non-white person really was treated as somebody that was like less than white. So they were treated as second-class citizens. They were not treated with the same rights. They were treated as like less than human. They were made to have their own schools, their own communities. They were only allowed to go to certain places, their own bathrooms, their own water fountains, everything like that. So in 1963, a lot of began this civil rights movement, which was when Black people started to protest and fight for their rights to be considered equals like the white people in America. So we'll start here. In 1865, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution ended slavery. Nearly a century later, 100 years later, African Americans continued to struggle for equality under the law. A number of major events in this dramatic battle took place in 1963. In April of that year, from behind the bars of a jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote a message that would inspire countless others. King had been arrested for breaking a law banning public protest. His message, the famous letter from Birmingham jail, defends nonviolent resistance to injustice. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, King wrote. He added, whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Okay, so we're starting here with this paragraph. So for almost 100, so in 1865, slavery had officially ended in America. And so 100 years later, almost 100 years later in 1963, Black people were still treated like slaves. Not quite like slaves, but they were still not treated with like respect or given as many rights. And they were not really, they were still treated very, very poorly. So in Alabama, which is a state, there's a very famous Black person. His name is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he is basically the most famous person that was alive during the civil rights movement. He organized several protests, peaceful protests that were protesting the government. So he would organize and collect not only Black people, but also many white people that were in support of Black people gaining their rights. And they would march from city to city or from state to state, just on their feet, just marching and walking and doing all these peaceful protests, demanding equal rights for Black people. And because of this, he was arrested more than once and put in jail for simply protesting the government and saying that Black people deserved the same rights as white people. So then it brings up a couple fairly famous quotes from this first letter that he wrote, the letter from Birmingham jail. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So basically, if it affects this one person, then if it affects this one person, like let's say that since he was arrested for protesting for equal rights, even though in America you should be allowed to protest peacefully, then that means that anybody who protests peacefully, they can also be arrested. This is against the laws in America that were made in America in order to protect the people of America. So being treated unfairly is a threat to being so justice, for example, is like being treated fairly. Injustice is not being treated fairly. So what he says is not being treated fairly anywhere is a threat to being treated fairly everywhere. So if there's injustice for a few people, then that means that that it's possible and very easy for there to be this same injustice for anybody. So if it only affects some people, that means it affects everybody also. In early May, the young people of Birmingham took King's message to heart. Disobeying a court order, more than 1,000 African American students marched from the 16th Street Baptist Church. The next day, the students marched through Kelly Ingram Park. They were met by an angry white mob as well as police, who blasted them with water from fire hoses and terrified them with dogs. The teenagers were jailed in temporary cells at the county fairgrounds. On the seventh day of the Children's Crusade, city officials agreed to negotiate with the African American community. A few days later, the two sides reached an agreement to end local segregation. Okay, segregation, this is what I was talking about when I said that Black people had different rights. So there was this law that existed in America at this time called segregation, and it meant separate but equal. That was like the main idea of this law. That means that white people and Black people, they are allowed to have the basic needs that everybody should have, but the white people are supposed to have their own, and the Black people should have a separate one. So for example, drinking fountains, like just being able to drink water publicly for free, the white people would have their drinking fountains, and Black people were not allowed to use the white people's drinking fountains. They had to use a drinking water fountain that was separate from the white people's. They also were not allowed to use the same bathrooms. So if you would go to like a cafe, they would have restaurants, or a cafe would have a bathroom that was for white people only, and and maybe a bathroom for Black people, or maybe no bathroom for Black people at all. Even some cafes would not allow Black people in at all. This was called segregation. So Black people were allowed to have their own businesses, their own cafes, their own bathrooms, and all these things, but they were not allowed to go into the white people's thing, the white people's cafes or the white people's businesses or anything like that. This was the law in Alabama at the time. So this Children's Crusade, this march, they took 1,000 college students, Black college students from this state, to march across all these cities on foot to protest these laws on foot. And at the end of it, they were in this big city area. Which city was it? They got to this Kelly Ingram Park, which is like a famous place in probably in Birmingham, and they were shot with fire hoses. A fire hose is like it's a very strong hose, like for shooting water at buildings. But it shoots the water at so much pressure that if you shoot it at a person, you will knock the person down, and you might even break their skin and make them like bleed and make them like and hurt them. And they also used attack dogs to these protesters. So these protesters, these people were protesting peacefully, asking for similar rights to end segregation, and they were met with police shooting them with water and very seriously injuring people, and also attacking them with dogs and also very seriously injuring people. And they even arrested a few people and sent them to a jail cell. And then finally, they negotiated at the end of 1 week of these kinds of protests. At the end of 7 days, the city finally agreed to negotiate some agreement to end the segregation in this area. News of the Children's Crusade spread in the media, helping to transform the way Americans saw the civil rights movement. The New York Times ran more stories about civil rights in the 2 weeks after the Children's Crusade than it had in the previous 2 years combined. Scenes of children under attack were filmed and broadcast all over the world, setting off a global outcry. Polls showed that Americans across the land believed racial justice was the nation's biggest problem. The struggle for civil rights continued to be marked by violence. On May 28, 1963, 4 African-American college students in Jackson, Mississippi were assaulted for sitting at a segregated lunch counter. 2 weeks later, on June 12th, an assassin killed civil rights activist Medgar Evers outside his home in Jackson. That summer brought a landmark event in civil rights history. This was the March for Jobs and Freedom that took place in Washington, D.C. on August 28th. Under the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech to a crowd of 200,000 people from all walks of life. The peace and hope of that event did not last long. On September 15th, a bomb exploded inside Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church. The attack killed 4 little African-American girls and injured 22 other people. The struggle continued throughout 1963. The Southern Regional Council has records of protests that took place in more than 100 Southern towns. Approximately 20,000 demonstrators were arrested. With words and actions, they delivered a demand for justice that could not be ignored. Okay, so in this year, what we're talking about in this year, 1963, during this summer, it was only in a matter of a few months. There's this very famous newspaper, the New York Times. This is internationally well known, but especially in America at the time, in this year, this was one of the most famous newspapers that spread throughout the entire nation, throughout the whole country. So everybody was reading the New York Times. So all of this protesting finally caught attention in the media. And remember, at this time, the only media was mostly radio, maybe a little bit of television, but most homes did not have their own television. You had to be very wealthy or very rich to watch TV or to even own a TV. So the biggest media was either newspaper or radio. And so after this children's crusade, after this protest that saw so many people injured and that ended the segregation, the law in Alabama, for the next 2 weeks, the New York Times ran more stories about the civil rights movement than the last 2 years that they had said anything. So this was really the beginning of how influential the civil rights movement was in the United States, in America. Over the next few months, on May 28th, there was another violent attack. There were 4 black college students in Mississippi that were attacked just for sitting at a segregated lunch counter. That means that they went to eat lunch somewhere, and where they were eating, the restaurant had a table for black people and a table for white people. These 4 black people, these 4 black students, they were eating at a table for white people, and they got attacked and were attacked violently and very seriously hurt. 2 weeks after that, a very famous civil rights activist, his name is Medgar Evers, he was killed outside of his own home in the same state in only 2 weeks after this. So this summer of 1963, there was this very large protest. It was called the March for Jobs and Freedom, and it was a protest that was meant to ask for more black people to have rights and for the availability of jobs and freedoms for black people. And it took place in the capital of the United States, Washington, D.C. This is the capital city, like the capital city in the United States. And that was when Dr. Martin Luther King delivered his very famous "I Have a Dream" speech to 200,000 people. This is a lot of people, especially at this time. This speech was also on television. It was also on radio. It's been written down several times, and it's a very famous speech. And it was not only black people that were there. There were also a lot of white people, and everybody, every kind of person was there. And everybody was there just to listen to himself, just to listen to this speech. But only, again, 2 weeks After this famous speech, another bomb, this 16th Street Baptist Church, this is a very famous landmark in the civil rights history. This is where a lot of black people who were very famous during the civil rights movement, they went to this church to work together to come up with all of these protests and these ideas. So this is a very famous place in the civil rights history. So on September 15th, after 2 weeks after his Dr. King's speech, a bomb blew up in this church and killed 4 little girls and 22 other people. So as you can see, there was a lot of violence that was attached to the civil rights movement. And not just violence for anybody, violence specifically targeting black people that were only asking to be treated equally and fairly and justified. The struggle continued. Okay, and then so this part is just saying that there were over 100 towns that had over 100 cities in that year that had a lot of different protests that were asking for these similar protests of asking to stop segregation and for black people to have the same rights. About 20,000 people were arrested just for protesting and asking for the same rights. And this really got the attention of the entire nation. And I believe that's it. Yep. Okay, so this is the beginning of the civil rights movement in America. And for the next part, we were going to go over the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King. But I just want you to understand how much different the time was in America in this year. Black people were not really allowed to vote. They were allowed to vote, but their votes didn't really count the same way that white people's votes counted. So if it came to trying to elect some sort of government official, not only like the president, but like the local government official or somebody to represent you and your people and your community to the government at large, which is part of how the American government works. They elect government officials like senators and congressmen to represent these cities and these people when they go to the government to discuss the new laws and everything. So black people, their vote counted only for 3/5 of a full vote. That means that for every 1 American vote, 2 black people would have to vote for it to count as 1 vote. So 2 black people would have to vote for the same person for that 1 person to get even 1 vote. Whereas white people, their votes count as 1 vote. This was called the 3/5 law. Another thing, all of this segregation that was going on, all of the black people's bathrooms and water fountains and restaurants and everything like that, they had their own schools. They were not allowed to leave their communities. They were barely even allowed to own land or own property. And all of the things that black people were allowed to own or even use, all of the facilities and all the things they were allowed to use were not nearly as nice or even taken care of as the things that white people were allowed to use. So like the white people's bathrooms, maybe they were cleaned off like often and they looked nice. The black people's bathrooms would maybe be like a hole outside somewhere or an outhouse. Like they did not have the same sort of facilities, or maybe their bathrooms were very dirty and nobody ever took care of them, and they were always like they were never working. Or the black people's water fountain would give out like really gross, really dirty water, and the white people would have really clean water for their water fountain. This was what segregation was. Black people had their own schools. They were not allowed to go to the same school as white people. So the black people would go to school and their education didn't look as good as the white people's education. So they were not taught the same way. They were not taught the same materials. They were just not given the same opportunities, and they were not allowed to even live a fair or the same sort of life as the white people who were already living the life. And so this was what caused the civil rights movement in America in 1963.